So welcome to L&D in 20, your go-to resource for all things workplace learning, brought to you by Go One. I'm your host, Dan Hayward, Chief Customer Officer and industry veteran. Today on the show, I'm super excited to be speaking with Dan MacPhail, Director of Organizational Capability here at Go One, where he leads his team to design and implement large-scale initiatives fully focused on optimizing business performance through building high-performing teams. Dan is an expert in talent strategies that drive business transformation, designing employee-centric programs to accelerate speed to competency, developing strong leadership communities, and building sustainable talent ecosystems for long-term success. Dan, welcome to the show. Super excited. It's going to be a tale of two Dans today. So
it will.
So the topic for today, super excited, is ways to foster a culture of learning at work in hybrid environments. So as we all know, many companies have had to make that pivot from fostering the workplace culture in person in those physical premises to now being kind of hybrid or remote setting. Tell me a little bit about how you think about adjusting and making that pivot and some of your experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so much has changed, hasn't it, since COVID and the immediate shift to being remote or at least hybrid in so many of our organizations. And, you know, I think that the one thing that came out of COVID, certainly for me, as I kind of reflect on that, is that there was this moment where companies really started to realize that the problems that they face are not necessarily that unique, are they? They are obviously very unique in their own context, and their problems have very nuanced considerations that need to be made when they're solving them. But when we boil those back down to the core challenges and the opportunities that we have to kind of work through those challenges, we're actually just dealing with the same things. Somewhere along the line, we realized that the core capabilities and the skills that we need are actually the same. And so then, you know, I kind of reflect on that, Dan, and I realized that the move to remote work was actually a really good example of that. Suddenly, every company in the world was grappling with this idea of staying alive in an environment that was entirely new, at least on a scale that we saw it happening. And, you know, so why is that important in the context of L&D? I suppose L&D practitioners really had to pivot, didn't they, from a focus on making sure that content was bespoke and really finely tuned to actually prioritizing making sure that learning was designed to come to the people in the flow of their work. It became really critical that people were able to access it regardless of where they were, regardless of the togetherness. And that certainly kind of sat at the center of my thinking when we were talking about how to continue upskilling our teams in a remote environment. Definitely.
Yeah. And what were some of the specific kind of challenges that I guess you addressed then, or we're continuing to address when we think about kind of remote and in particular kind of hybrid work environments from an L&D perspective?
If we think about some of the things that changed immediately, there was almost there was a very sudden lack of informal learning, wasn't there? Like when we all came together for training in training rooms, and you know we might go to seminars and come together. There was definitely a loss, and I still feel that. I'm not sure that that's necessarily something that we have nailed as an L&D community yet, is this idea of people coming together and picking up skills through casual interactions and shadowing or impromptu discussions that happen in the flow of real conversation. I think we're getting there. I think that there are definitely ways that we come together virtually, but we're still working out how to do that really, really effectively, I think, in a digital world. There's also fewer opportunities for peer mentorship. So without those in-person interactions that can happen in a live environment, it's harder to foster those organic mentorships or on-the-job trainings, I think. They need more structural approaches. That's actually the opposite of what digital learning and creating a digital learning environment is, which, as I said before, it kind of happens in the flow of people's work. And it's on demand. So those two things kind of fly in the face of each other. And then finally, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we have, certainly that I notice, is the distractions that can sometimes happen when we're working from home.
Mhm.
And some of those distractions are also the beautiful things about working from home. You can have family around, you can have your pets around, but they are distractions, aren't they? And as opposed to being in a training room where your attention is fully focused. And again, maybe that's something that's left for us to continue problem solving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's dig
Mm.
into. I really want to dig into that question there that you raised around kind of those informal interactions and and the need to create more structure there. So can you tell me some of the things that you and the team doing when you're looking at, I guess, the kind of L&D calendar for the organization? Like, what are some of the ways that you're creating those opportunities for not just the formal learning, but some of those informal engagements as well?
Yeah, for sure. The thing that I mentioned before in terms of making sure that um, content is accessible and that it happens in the flow of people's work doesn't mean that the importance of that content being right starts to diminish. In fact, the opposite is true. We need to make sure that the content is absolutely relevant to the learner and that it's more engaging in some ways than when you have a captured audience who's sitting in a room. So, in fact, grasping the attention of a remote audience who isn't captured in a room requires more thought in terms of making sure that it's engaging.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the focus on making sure that the underlying competencies and skills are right started to give way during that pivot to remote learning, to focusing on in-house generated elements of L&D that we used to spend a lot of time and money and resource
Hmm.
on getting right. It just wasn't important anymore
Yeah.
after that. And I think that really highlights the role that L&D has, which is to think about how learning ties into the broader strategic objectives of the business, and then leveraging those one-to-many resources that are far more cost-effective than having face-to-face one-time initiatives,
Hmm.
and using those in tandem with like really strong, bespoke messages about why that learning is important to the individual and to the business's success. And that might come through key sponsorship activity from the executive and senior level. It could also be tied back to the company's values and behaviors so that remote workers can see the importance and significance to their own contribution and to the success of the business. I think those things are critical to think about when we are pulling together L&D strategies for digital digital audiences, for sure.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's great. And I know that you spent a lot of time focusing on leadership development and growth. You've developed a great program here for us to kind of work through. I think that the role of the leader is so important in connecting the dots. And so we're kind of going through what we call the growth map conversation period here, which happens kind of 3 to 4 times a year. So talk to us a little bit about that
Yes.
and the relevance and the importance of the managers engaging that level and really kind of helping to show that not necessarily the journey, but like presenting the map and having a conversation about where the employee may be able to go.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think that tying the content of an L&D program or a suite of L&D programs to the relevancy and the strategic
Mm.
objectives that the organization is trying to achieve is critical if we're going to provide meaning to an audience about why we want them to do that. And growth map conversations, as you're mentioning there, Dan, which are our performance management cycles, if you like, here at Go One. We run 3 of them per year. 2 of them are focused on performance, and they're retrospective conversations about the last 6 months, what we've achieved, and whether or not we hit those goals that we set with our managers 6 months ago. And then once a year, we have a development focused growth map conversation, which is forward focused, and looks at the next 12 months. And in those conversations is where we sit and talk to our managers about what we need to do, what our opportunities are, and then taking a strengths based approach to developing ourselves over the next 12 months.
Mhm.
I love the development growth map conversations because for 2 reasons. First of all, I mean, we are making a commitment to our employees about how we're going to support them in building their professional careers. And one of the outputs of those conversations is a very robust development plan, which includes learning and development and developing the skills and competencies that people need in order to hit their audacious goals, both for them individually and also for the organization as well. It's a
That's
real
great.
commitment to learning
Yeah.
and development. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I love it. I think it's a great program. And so one of the things that I know, we hear a lot from our customers, and we've spoken about, is kind of creating the culture of learning, or um, working for an organization that has this inherent culture of learning. Can you talk to me a little bit
Yeah.
about kind of how do you know if you've got one? Like, what does the culture of learning look like to you?
Yeah, it's such a great question. it's it's such a great question, and I think it's something, certainly when I speak to my peers in the
Yeah.
industry, it's this esoteric
Hmm.
question that everybody wants the answer to. I mean, for me, it's quite straightforward, and I think that's maybe because I work for a learning and development organization, I'm in a privileged position to be able to see that pretty clearly. But for me, I don't think that you could have a learning culture in your organization if you didn't have regular knowledge sharing, that there was, and this is particularly important, very intentional commitment from the organization to have time carved out for learning.
Hmm.
I think that if we start to talk to employees about the importance of learning and development, and we say that their professional development is important, but we ask them to do that as something that is extra to the job that they're employed to do, or something auxiliary to their day-to-day tasks, that we run a very dangerous line of telling them that it's also not very important. And so carving time out for them to learn and develop as part of their day becomes critically important. And, here at Go One, obviously we have quarterly learning days that are completely dedicated to that. We also have dedicated individual learning budgets that people are able to spend on whatever learning and development initiatives they feel are important, in combination with their managers for their own professional development. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that is an organized program. It's not something that
Hmm.
we ask people to complete. If they stumble on something that is important to them, or that they see is going to help them do their work
Hmm.
better, they can spend that budget on that, and that really gives them autonomy over their own L&D. I think another element of a really thriving learning culture is that leaders model and promote learning actively across the organization. We hear leaders at all levels of the organization talking about learning that they have recently done, the impact that it's had on them, and then sharing that in some way, whether that's through some kind of playback, or just simply sharing the course that they completed online.
Yeah.
And I think what all of these things come together to create, Dan, is this atmosphere of openness to new ideas. Um, Initiative gets rewarded. This idea of people leaning into their own opportunities and challenges, and potentially competency deficits, and actively filling those, is something to be admired and
Yeah.
rewarded. It's not something that's seen as a failure, or yeah, so, or something that needs to be fixed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, I love that. I think that kind of sense of individual accountability, especially with the kind of
Yeah.
the individual education budgets, like you own it. There's inherently a sense of curiosity, and then I think what I love there you said is also around kind of the sharing. People, quite often will
Yes.
complete something, they'll engage in a course or buy a book, or they'll
Yeah.
join a webinar, and then they'll share that back out with everyone else. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next segment, Dan. This is the 60-second budget breakdown. So what I'd like to know from you is, what are the three most important things that you currently spend your budget on?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of priority, Dan, I think, in the context of that digital learning environment that we were talking about, you really must prioritize having a solid one-to-many content library.
Mhm.
And that could be anything, right? Like, that could be something that you create in-house. It could be something that your own L&D practitioners have created. It could be third-party content that you've bought off the shelf. But this idea of being able to reach a very large audience with a high-value digital suite is important, so that people can get to the content that they need. That has to be priority number one. And then that allows whatever's left in the budget to, I suppose, focus on the high impact initiatives. And the second priority, I suppose, from my perspective, is how do you get the most bang for your buck in those high impact scenarios? Is that bringing people together? Is that sending cohorts to a particular seminar? Is that running some kind of bespoke training initiative where a cohort of people travel through that together? Is the second priority. And then the third is really through interventions like development growth map conversations, as we were talking about, identifying coaching opportunities for people where we can really drill down into very bespoke outcomes and really commit to the individual to say, we value you and we want you to, you're an important part of our business, and we want you to get from A to B through this particular coaching intervention. Obviously, we've got a sliding scale of cost there, and hence the priority. But also, you'll notice that starting with a broad range of employees has to be the start. Otherwise, you touch very small parts of the organization. So going from breadth to refined, and I suppose from return on investment down into a more expensive intervention. Yeah.
Oh, great insight. Thank you. So moving on to our next segment, lifelong learnings. Would you be open to sharing your biggest learning from a situation that turned out different than expected, either positive or negatively?
Yeah, I've got a few, Dan, but the one that comes to mind, I won't mention the employer, but in a previous world, I was in a very privileged position to be training a new cohort of employees in South Africa. One of the products that these South African employees was going to be selling to Australian customers was related to Australian healthcare, and one of the underlying really important core understandings that they needed to have to do that was the Australian healthcare system, which was obviously completely foreign to a South African audience. We naively went to train our new South African colleagues and assumed all of this knowledge that they would have about what having a world-class public healthcare system is like. That was obviously absent. And so we really had to rethink our learning outcomes and I suppose our assumed knowledge and go right back to basics on how we went about helping those people understand how to have really robust conversations with an Australian about things that they inherently knew just by virtue of the fact that they were here. That was a real challenge. That was a real challenge for me and the team. But it was an excellent learning experience. Yeah.
Awesome. And going forward, no more assumptions ever again, I'm sure.
No more assumptions ever again. That was absolutely the learning that came out of that one for us, for sure.
That's great. So now let's move on to our final segment, self-development hacks. I'd love to know, what's your favorite L&D related content resource? Like, where do you go to grow?
I've got a few favorites, but I think that my favorite is actually Masterclass. And I'll tell you why. I love the way that Masterclass brings together really important and well-known figures with this concept of self-development and learning. I think it's so beautiful the way that they have really kind of inspired people to develop themselves outside of the context of corporate learning, which sometimes there is overlay. In fact, often in Masterclass, there is overlay between someone's professional life and their personal life. But it really does start to put on a pedestal this idea of professional development and the importance of sponsorship from people that you know and respect, giving you lessons quite directly to you in your own home. I think they've really nailed that concept, and I use it every week. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Well, Dan, that was a quick 20 minutes. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
Thanks for tuning into the show. I'm Dan Hayward, Chief Customer Officer, and that wraps up another episode of L&D in 20. We hope you found today's discussion as engaging as we did. Whether you're listening on the go or at your desk, we'll catch you on the next episode. And until then, keep learning.
This show is brought to you by Go1, the most diverse learning content aggregator. To learn how you can empower your employees with the right content at the right time, all in one subscription, visit go1.com or click the link in the show notes. And to stay up to date on future episodes of L&D in 20, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.